I am a staff member of the United Nations, and for the last 12 years, my job has been to support the UN's efforts to end a number of violent conflicts, including in Sudan, Syria, and the wider Middle East region. With climate change and nuclear weapons looming over our planet, I wanted to join the UN because, in the words of Faulkner and Garcia Marquez, I refuse to accept the end of mankind. And I believe it is not yet too late to work for a world in which no one will be able to decide for others how they die, and where the races condemned to 100 years of solitude will have at last and forever a second opportunity on Earth. 12 years later, I still cannot imagine a more worthwhile endeavor than working for the UN to help facilitate political constraints on aggression, on violence, and the arrogance of those who feel entitled to decide for others how they die. I don't know why my countless talented colleagues do this work. You would have to invite them here to find out, but that is why I do it. At its most intense moments, my work has involved driving in armored cars across Syria, wearing flak jackets, meeting with government officials and opposition leaders, with the incessant sound of mortar fire and automatic weapons shaking the windows of a former kindergarten where one such meeting was taking place. It involved flying on helicopters across the Sudan, sitting under the sun of the Sahara Desert with refugees and tribal leaders and rebel leaders, listening to them recount the horrors they had endured at the hands of the Janjaweed militia. It involved working with military experts to deploy thousands of troops, tanks, and helicopters to war zones, to places where the Security Council had mandated peacekeeping operations. And at its most glamorous moments, it involved preparing and attending the Secretary General's meetings with heads of state and government at summits such as the G8 or the G20. This work to save future generations from the scourge of war was prescribed in the UN Charter by the victors of World War II. And that was a war that killed 80 million people, including 6 million Jews. How are we doing? Not so well, if you read the news. But what does it really take to end violent conflict? Actually, I believe conflict never really ends. It simply mutates. And if war is politics by other means, then peace is not the absence of war, but rather war by other means. What do I mean when I say that? I mean that the natural competition over power, resources, and prestige that come with political influence never ends, does not end after the signing of a peace agreement. It continues, and it is carried out with peaceful means such as elections, information, misinformation, fake news, anyone? So the job of the peacemaker is to understand so deeply the needs that drive violence so as to be able to design a process and a political system whereby those needs can be fulfilled without the use of force, whereby the confrontation moves from the battleground of physical destruction to the battlefield of intellectual combat, to the marketplace of ideas. Now, for the peacemaker or mediator, this requires a very close familiarity with the logic of violence. It also requires diplomacy, empathy, imagination, leverage, time, and force. Sometimes diplomacy of this particular kind, you have up there a picture of an aircraft carrier, also known as 90,000 tons of diplomacy in military speak, is particularly useful, especially when you're dealing with actors who calculate that they benefit more from the continuation of the war than from any kind of peaceful settlement. Over time, peace agreements have become more and more complex as our understanding of the many pillars that underpin peace has evolved. And that includes power sharing, resource sharing, security arrangements, and justice and reconciliation. Now, conflict resolution is an academic discipline now. There are wonderful textbooks about it, and they're very useful when you're dealing with actors who are truly committed to ending their conflict. They're a little bit less useful when you're dealing with actors who calculate that they benefit more in terms of power, resources, and prestige from the chaos of the war than from any kind of peaceful settlement. The place where one gets to read about those kinds of conflicts is called history books. And one such book is the account of the 30 Years' War by Veronica Wedgwood. That was a war that had killed 8 million people in Central Europe between 1618 and 1648. And she concluded wistfully that after the expenditure of so much human life for so little purpose, i.e. religion, man did not grasp the essential futility of putting the beliefs of the mind to the judgment of the sword. For war breeds only war. History books also remind us that on Christmas Eve in 1940, the father of nonviolent resistance, Mahatma Gandhi, wrote to Hitler to try to appeal to him to stop the war. He warned him that violence was nobody's monopoly, and that if not the British, some other power will surely develop weapons that were better than his, and that they would ultimately defeat him. He warned him that he would leave no proud legacy to his people with a recital of violence that he was performing. And indeed, that proved to be a remarkable prophecy. Weapons more sophisticated than Hitler's were developed and ultimately defeated him. Indeed, he did not leave any proud legacy to his people. He left a legacy of horror and shame. Now, violence will always exist. It is part of human nature. Conflict over power and resources will likewise always exist. But all wars end. People do not want to and cannot fight endlessly for multiple generations. The average duration of war was 10 years over the last century. Do you know what happens when all key actors get tired of fighting? Well, they look for leaders who are capable of reconciling the apparently irreconcilable sides and of healing the traumas of the war. What do you think is harder, being a leader who takes their country to peace or being a leader who takes their country to war? I assure you that any average criminal, any insane person can order a massacre. Anyone, no matter how weak or cowardly they are, can sign a declaration of war, can press a nuclear button, can order the generals to undertake a drone attack. Peace is 1,000 times more difficult. For peace, you cannot simply press a button or sign an order. Achieving peace requires reconciling dozens of conflicting interests and healing the traumas of families seeking revenge. Do you know the enormity of the moral force required to ask a father to not seek revenge against those who have killed his son because the spiral of violence would otherwise go on endlessly? Nelson Mandela was one such leader. Like Gandhi, through the power of his ideas, he defeated a regime that included an army, a secret service, and a police. Do you know what underpinned his wisdom and his success? Mandela believed that a good mind and a good heart were always a formidable combination. But when you add to that a literate tongue or pen, then you have something really special. That is the mathematical formula of a leader capable to bring peace to his people. And it is an association of qualities that in reality is hard to find. Good minds are easy to find in our era of education and information. Good hearts are harder to find next to a good mind because educating courage is difficult. But when you add to that erudition and eloquence, then any one of you can become such a leader capable of healing the wounds of war and bringing peace. This is the lesson I hope you remember from me today. War is easy. Peace is hard. For peace, you need strong minds, good hearts, powerful voices. For war, a single button is sufficient. Now, when wars do start, among their most visible and enduring consequence are displacement and refugees. They are also the stickiest point in any peace negotiation. The enormity of their trauma and the legitimacy of their grievances are rarely matched by solutions that are adequate and relevant to their lifetimes. The world is witnessing the largest refugee problem on record. 68.5 million people have been forced from their homes. And a refugee spends an average of 17 years in camps without any of the elements that underpin our conception of human dignity. Now, aside from moral outrage, we face a practical problem in that refugee camps are environments that radicalize, and they are a major predictor and driver of future conflict. I understood why when I visited Lebanon in 2005. This was right after the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, and I was on vacation. This was before I joined the UN, and that was my idea of fun. I wanted to visit 2 refugee camps outside Beirut, in southern Beirut, and I saw a lot of images that looked like that. And I understood then that the meaninglessness of living for decades without the right to travel, to work, or to vote render refugee camps everywhere a Maslowian nightmare. That's the pyramid of needs up there. I also realized how humanity's worst instincts thrive on the fear, humiliation, and rage that any single one of us would feel if we were in their place. The United Nations is currently undergoing a massive process of reform of its development and peace and security architecture. It aims to enable the organization to have a greater impact in preventing conflict and sustaining peace, rather than spending the majority of its resources managing the consequences of war. This is welcome because the vast majority of human rights violations occur during wartime, and they occur with impunity. We are, by the way, in no danger of me disclosing any sensitive details about that reform process because I have been on maternity leave for the last 12 months. But I would like to suggest that the work of conflict prevention might be guided by the words of a great Arab thinker and historian by the name of Ibn Khaldun. We must learn to listen to people's whispers when they are praying, otherwise we will be forced to hear their battle cries. And I would like to invite all of you here today who think you're interested in peace to begin to listen to the whispers of prayer in refugee camps. Now that won't be enough. What about the sheer complexity of conflict? My boss at the UN used to joke, one of my bosses, that if you think you understand the Middle East, you haven't been fully briefed. Indeed, conflicts everywhere are so complex that designing a credible political intervention, a meaningful mediation, requires reading so much until you become mortified about how little you know and how little you can possibly know. Intelligence officers will tell you that over 60 variables are at play in a conflict at any given time, and that the human mind can only process 6 to 7 variables at the same time. If this is the case, could computers become better at political analysis and safeguarding peace than human beings? It is probably not wise to stand here and argue with one of the smartest and most popular men on this planet, someone by the name of Yuval Noah Harari, author of Sapiens and Homo Deus. He argues that the world is moving from humanism to dataism, from a time when human will and experience constituted the supreme source of authority and meaning in this world, to a time when information and data, for its own sake, becomes the absolute value. Because the capacity of the human mind to process the avalanche of information that has become available is so small that it is quickly becoming irrelevant. Perhaps he's right. And if he is right, then computers will soon become able to make better decisions about war and peace than human beings. But then it will matter greatly how the goal of the algorithm is articulated and the worldview of the entity articulating it. If perpetuation of the human species and of biodiversity is an objective, then science can indeed tell us a lot about how to alleviate poverty, injustice, inequality, how to end wars, how to reduce carbon monoxide emissions. If, on the other hand, the goal is perfecting the means of violence and mass destruction, then the algorithm will tell a very different and terrifying story indeed. For the time being, human conscience remains the sole source of meaning in this world. And as long as that is the case, we can still make claims of solidarity from one another. And the UN, the United Nations, is a place that embodies the promise of humanism like no other. I invite all of you to help design those algorithms that deliver the best outcomes for our planet, including a world where no one will be able to decide for others how they die, and where those whispering their prayer in the cold solitude of refugee camps will have at last and forever a second opportunity on Earth. And until the algorithms are ready, I invite you to become and elect the kinds of leaders who have good minds, good hearts, and powerful voices. The kinds of leaders who know and do better than putting the beliefs of the mind to the judgment of the sword.